All right. Well, while everybody is typing their introductions in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So thank you all for joining us for today's webinar titled People, Place, and Culture. This is the second webinar in our fall series on climate, health, and equity. I'm Rebecca Ward. I'll be co-hosting today's webinar with Max Colley, who's was just talking, and who is a co-PI for the Carolinas Collaborative on Climate, Health, and Equity, or C3HE. In case you missed our first webinar, just a little bit more about C3HE. We are a NOAA Climate Adaptation Partnership. We're one of 13 regional centers nationwide who are working alongside communities to foster climate resilience. We're housed at NC State University and are a multi-institution team. So you can see by our logos there, everyone who is involved in our program. And we're made up of social scientists, community leaders, physical scientists, researchers, outreach professionals, and students. And our work centers on building community partnerships to advance climate resilience and health equity. So to that end, we work together with communities across the Carolinas to help predict and understand their exposure and vulnerability to consecutive and compounding climate hazards, such as flooding, heat, and drought. And in addition, our team's focus is on understanding our changing climate and addressing the impacts in a just and equitable way. So we integrate social science and physical science and regional knowledge to co-produce solutions. And we also focus our efforts on frontline and at-risk populations, and in so doing, aim to support communities that are disproportionately exposed to climate hazards and other compounding social inequities. If you'd like to learn more about our program, we encourage you to visit our website, carolinascap.com, which you can see in the lower right of the slide here. You can also reach out to our team. You can join our webinars like today. Thank you for being here. And we also have some upcoming webinars planned for future months. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Max to introduce our panelists and kick off today's webinar. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ward. Today's conversation builds off of some of the excellent conversation that we had in the last webinar that we hosted for C3HE. I'm going to put that there into the chat. And in that webinar, which was focused on environmental justice, one panelist in particular, Dr. Rosalind Powell, talked about some of her incredibly important work in doing oral histories and an examination of people working and doing interpretive work at plantation sites. The work that occurs in places like that is incredibly important and formative in understanding community-engaged climate, equity, and health work within communities in the Carolinas and across the United States. It's incredibly important to remember that as we do this work, our communities did not assemble themselves randomly. Our communities today are products of long and complicated histories that are sometimes very difficult both for publics, academics, and researchers to understand without the necessary context. That context, we argue, may be best gleaned from people and professionals and practitioners like the people who make up our panel today and the organizations that they work at. Organizations that are incredibly varied in their work, but share common themes in that they protect and preserve important cultural history, traditions, practices, and they also steward and are trusted with that stewardship of the future of the communities that they serve. We're going to start today's conversation by thinking about just that term community, which is an incredibly ubiquitous term to the point where it has perhaps lost some of its meaning. I'm going to start by having our esteemed panelists, my colleagues today, introduce themselves. And the first question that I'm going to pose to them as they introduce themselves is to just think about that term community and what it means to them. All of our panelists work to preserve and tell stories of the past of their communities and are trusted with stewarding the future of the places that they live and the people that they serve. I can't think of anybody better qualified to talk about those communities. So the first question as you introduce yourself is, can you describe your community, its strengths, its challenges, its history, and the opportunities there related to climate and health and equity? I'm going to start the conversation by turning that question and an introduction over to my friend and colleague, Angela Lee.
Thank you, Max, and good morning, all. I am with the Hayti Heritage Center, a cultural arts and arts education venue located in Durham, North Carolina. We are located in the historic Hayti community, and it really is a community, although it is surrounded by other neighborhoods, other communities, if you will. The Hayti community was born in the wake of after emancipation, during Jim Crow segregation, and there was, at the time of emancipation, one of the largest plantations in Durham, Stagville, and many of the men, women, and children who were on Stagville's plantation just settled nearby in what became known as the Hayti community. Segregation meant that they could only settle in certain parts of the city. So the community was born. It is today, the Hayti community is about 95% African-American still, although it is surrounded by increasing gentrification. There are multi-generations of residents still there. There are also a number of small businesses. The community was turned upside down with installation of a highway right at the peak of its thriving economic success, if you will. And not a lot of reinvestment has occurred, but the community is still there. So there are still people who gather at our venue, which has been a community hub, a cultural hub, since 1975, but the structure was originally a church built in 1891. So it's still a place of gathering, and there's a real sense of community despite the challenges that have impacted it. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Deb Littlejohn. Dr. Littlejohn.
So hi, I'm Deb Littlejohn, and I'm from the College of Design. I'm an associate professor in design and user experience at North Carolina State University. And I would say that there's two threads of the communities that I work with. In research context, the communities are, I would define as co-knowledge producers and collaborators and stakeholders in the research process. So they're helping, the transdisciplinary teams that I'm working on to help us shape research questions. And, we don't see them as just sources of data, for example. They are actually helping us with the research, helping us focus our questions and helping us come up with solutions, especially with regards to, climate change and how that is affecting their day-to-day lives. And then the other thread of community, I would say, is in my work with museums, where the community would be the people who need to understand, let's say, complicated, complex ideas related to climate change in some cases, or in voicing their identities in others. And so the communities are people who need to understand science. And so how in my field of design, how we translate complex scientific findings for general audiences at museums.
Thank you, Dr. Littlejohn. I'm going to turn it over now to Cassandra Williams-Rush. Ms. Rush.
Good morning, everyone. I am Cassandra Williams-Rush with the C. Williams-Rush Museum of African American Arts and Culture in Kingstree, South Carolina. I'm sure many of you asked, well, where is Kingstree? It's the county seat and located in Williamsburg County, which is about 72 miles north of Charleston, about 50 miles inland from Georgetown. So that's our location close to the coast of South Carolina. Williamsburg County, and I'll mainly consider, I guess, the Kingstree community, since the population there is only about 3,100, but 70% Black. The entire county is 67% African American. So we are, and always have been historically, a predominantly Black community. And with that come concerns of environmental justice. some of our strengths, I guess during the civil rights era, Jim Crow era, we had a very active civil rights movement, such that it brought Dr. King to my high school, Tomlinson, to speak. That was May 8th of 1966. So Dr. King made a trip to King Street and spoke at that time. We have some very rich African-American history there in King Street. And Max might remember my saying that we have 3 HBCU, that's historically Black college and university presidents, that were born, reared, and educated in Williamsburg County, and 4 more that have direct ties. So we have some really good strengths. And I think part of that might go back to the fact that my high school, Tomlinson, was started in 1866. So the year after slavery ended, the Freedmen's Bureau started a school there. And as a result, numerous other schools were started throughout the community. So I think that's very, very helpful and good to know as well. As far as health, of course, when there is a high percentage of African Americans or people of color, you have high concerns for health. The health indicators are just really, really low. Diabetes. And my museum was engaged a while back in several projects, the first being the Communities for Immunity, and secondly, South Carolina Office of Rural Health and the South Carolina Center for Rural and Primary Health Care. We provided health screenings and other health services as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rush. And last, we'll turn it over to Dr. Rose Hendricks.
Thank you, Max. And it's so great to hear from all of you already. Hi, all. I'm Rose Hendricks. I am the Senior Advisor for Research at the Association for Science and Technology Centers, we often call ASTC. And for us, community is quite broad. So our community, for the purposes of our work, is largely science centers and museums, predominantly across the US, but we also have a sizable international membership as well. Our community has a wide range of budgets, some that are really small with just a couple of staff members, and others that are really large operations with multiple campuses and research operations in-house. Our community of science centers and museums has their own community contexts that they're by and large very steeped in. They have different missions and focus areas. So this includes like aviation centers, natural history, children's and science museums, aquariums, planetariums. So quite broad overall. But they do share some common strengths, which are incredibly high levels of public trust. They have opportunities to interact with really large groups of people and diverse audiences on many dimensions. And for example, they often work with public schools, which means that all the kids in a local community can access and interact with these institutions. They've been engaging on climate and health for a long time. I would say by and large, engaging on equity is a bit newer, though some certainly do have longstanding engagements in those areas. And again, they have lots of deep local expertise. So all of these strengths, I think, together create the opportunity to serve as hubs for local communities to really deliberate what the right solutions are for them in the context of climate and planetary health and public health, co-create solutions that make sense and that address their particular priorities. There are opportunities for science centers and museums to educate on local opportunities and local action already taking place. But the flip side of that is a challenge, which is that they're traditionally really been focused on education. And so it's often a bit of a step to think about how we as a community serve as on-ramps to action, and how we invite and inspire everybody to take part in solutions in ways that that work for them. And so that's something I would say the community as a whole is making the shift and really learning a lot in the process, and where I'm excited to see more movement in the future.
Thanks, Dr. Hendricks. Rebecca, you can move on to the next question. As you can hear, the community is served by our panelists. The places that they do place-based learning are incredibly varied. The contexts in which they do their work and the communities, the people that they serve, and the foci that they engage people with are quite varied and different, from relatively small things like humanities arts and cultural centers, tribal museums, large-scale science centers to national-scale networks and academia. I'm so honored and excited for the conversation that we will have today, which I'm going to start having learned a bit about your communities with this question. How do you think about, or where do you hear about issues related to climate change and community health in your work around preservation, arts, humanities, storytelling, and engagement with your communities, knowing that, as Dr. Hendricks just pointed out, places of place-based learning like your own are often very, very well trusted within your communities and are places where people go to learn about their communities and to teach about their communities. So I guess the question is, what have you learned? How are you thinking about these issues in your work? I might start with Dr. Littlejohn, if you feel okay with being put on the spot.
Not at all, Max, no problem. So in design, and this is very specific to design fields, how we think about climate health and equity is very much related to storytelling in the projects that we work in our studio, for example. The master students are working on using technology. They're imagining future sciences of technologies being embedded in museums, in this case, Max's museum at the Durham Museum of Life and Science. Imagining how the technologies that are already there could be augmented with stories, let's say, of climate change. And so this storytelling aspect, I think, is really important, because probably the audience has all heard of, how do you communicate science from a textual, readerly approach. And in design, we, are concerned, we have the same concerns, but our outcomes are more visual. So how do you visually communicate ideas of climate science, especially where scientific findings and the way scientists write about their work is not exactly transparent to a general audience of folks who are not data analysts, folks who are not well-versed in science and, research questions and how you answer these things. And so the students and how design thinks about these issues has to do with how we visually translate it for different kinds of audiences. And, not just children at museums, but in general, professionals have to use findings of science, but they aren't necessarily well-versed in data analysts and scientific research. So different levels of translation for different types of audiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Littlejohn. I'll turn this question over to Angela.
Thanks, Max. There's so many things that I could say about this question, but in the interest of time, I'm trying to keep it very precise. So again, I am executive and artistic director of a cultural arts and arts education venue that is also an historic venue in an historic community. So it's impossible to disassociate the work I do with thoughts around climate, health, equity. Our community, as I said earlier, was decimated when a planned urban renewal brought a highway directly through the community. And about 600 structures were totally wiped out. And our building, our venue, is the last remaining original structure from Durham's Black Wall Street. So just to give an indication, it was a very vibrant business and residential community leading up until that time. Well, people also often talk about the houses that were torn down, the businesses, the lost, generational wealth. But it's also important to recognize that when all of those buildings, those homes and businesses were destroyed, so were all of the shade trees, the plants, everything that really created an ecosystem that was healthy for people who lived there. And those things were not replaced. So since the 60s, decades later, here we are. Our community has been determined to be an urban heat island. So when you think about health and climate, you think about the residents who have lived there, many of whom lived during that time when the community was so decimated. And there are many health issues that are impacted, losing all of the environmental friendly ecosystem. So that's one thing. And of course, when people are struggling with health, then they're less able and less prone to want to do things like spend time outside in the summer in the South, um, take their kids outside to walk, just things that we take for granted often. So there is your climate impact, your health impact, and of course your equity impact, because your access is not the same. The Haiti community is comprised of, as I said earlier, about 95% African American, but most of the people who live in the community live at or below, the average income level. So it's not a wealthy community. So they have to make hard and fast choices. So in my work, one of the beautiful things about art is to me the great communicator, and the arts are so important to our health across the board, our physical, our mental, our emotional health. And we use art, whether it's visual art, whether it's performing art, spoken art, poetry, to display or to portray or to show our thinking around climate and around environmental impacts. So it's constantly a part of our work, and being able to align what we do in the arts sector with, for example, what Max and his team do at the Museum of Life and Science is very impactful. And it's the way that together we will learn, because we can engage all ages, all generations in this conversation, and we can utilize the arts as a great communicator to describe our communities and how we're impacted. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. I might turn it over to Rose.
Sure, thank you. I think, as Angela said, there's so much to say on this and so many intersections among these topics. But one thing that really comes to mind for me is at ASTC, we generally talk about planetary health. So we're kind of mashing all three of them together into one term. And by that, we do really mean certainly climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, in the ways that all of those things impact simultaneously the health of the planet and the people at all scales, from the hyper local to the international. And so I think because they're all related and we need to address them simultaneously as well, we're really working with our community, the science centers and museums, to think about what it looks like at their local levels to address all three collectively. So what are the unique local opportunities for that advanced planetary health, that whether it means specifically for them reducing emissions or addressing particular pollutions and sources of pollution and the communities that those are impacting, or conserving species, working to engage in conservation projects. And how do they do those things, all of those in ways that build equity? And again, really recognizing how different this looks everywhere, even if we just take the United States. And as I said, our membership is actually broader. For some, there's really a focus on changing patterns that affect agriculture. For other communities, it's really about flooding or drought or air pollution. And, there are so many others too. And I think that's part of the benefit of talking about it under this planetary health umbrella, is that it really creates space for all those unique, specific issues to come to the front, and for communities to deliberate and find ways to move forward. I'll leave it there and pass it to someone else. Thank you.
Ms. Rush.
Yes, what I was thinking about during the conversation was, I think it was back in 2015 when Hurricane Florence came through and Kingstree was just flooded, I mean, enormously throughout Kingstree and the county. And I think it was at that time that most people probably became a bit more aware of the impacts of climate change, because in many instances when the weather reporters would give their reports, they would indicate and expand on into the climate change and global warming process. And as far as our activities in that is really at our vineyard and farm, which is the Williams Vineyard and Farm in Neesmith. Over the years there, I have celebrated Earth Day and would bring in tour groups, mainly children, and we would do activities. In fact, I really readily remember some pictures from an activity we did where we call it the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. So to me, that's part of the process of, I guess, storytelling and hands-on, really, and getting the young people more actively involved in some of the earlier and preliminary steps relative to climate change. Even though we all know that just a minor impact is not that significant to bring about changes, but collectively, those efforts can certainly have an impact in the future. So I will put forth more of an effort to do more programs such as those to get more young people involved.
Wonderful, Ms. Rush. And I'll say this segues really nicely into our next question, which is around how does your work that you're already doing promote understanding about climate, health, and equity within your communities? And I'll say sometimes we think of this as being that in order to do this, you need to do a program or you need to have some initiative that is focused specifically or called something related to climate and health and equity. But you all are not in this webinar randomly. You are here because all of you are already engaging in these questions with your communities. As some of you have noted, some of that is through artwork or storytelling or through data visualization. Be curious how you think your work promotes understanding about climate, health, and equity within your communities and across the Carolinas. I might start this time with Cassandra. I know you just went, but I also am excited to hear some more about your ongoing initiatives.
Okay, yes, I did indicate the vineyard and reduce, reuse, recycle. Even that day, getting the kids involved in, I guess, the recycling when it comes to food. The word doesn't come to me right now. The waste, the waste from the yard, debris, and the kitchen, all of that. We covered all of that. And in relation to the health issues, health concerns, as I mentioned, we are underserved population there in Williamsburg County. And I mentioned the Communities for Community initiative that we were involved in. Dr. Rose Hendricks, as she mentioned, ASTC, and the funding for that particular project came from ASTC and through IMLS, which is the Institute of Library Sciences and Museum and Library Services, and CDC. That was an effort within the communities, and really it was our effort throughout the state of South Carolina during COVID to get more people of color vaccinated. The initiative was concentrating mainly too on African-American men, since they had the highest percentage of not being vaccinated. So that project, I thought, went really well. We enjoyed participating and being involved and reaching out into the communities and interacting with people and getting people vaccinated. I mentioned previously too, the South Carolina Office of Rural Health and the South Carolina Center for Rural and Primary Health Care. So after the CMI funding, we received funding from those two entities. One of them provided us, we employed a mobile health unit to go into the various communities, because our efforts were after hours and weekends, because most programs are set up to reach people 9 to 5, Monday through Fridays. Well, a lot of people are working, and health to them is not that significant enough to leave work, maybe being penalized to leave work to get their health concerns addressed. So that was a very impactful process. And we also provided COVID screenings along with the health screenings And we also did a telehealth component of those projects. As far as equity, yes, the museum is very much actively involved in trying to ensure equity in all of the processes that we become involved in or introduced to, especially within the King Street community. So I think that's it.
Thanks so much. I'll turn it over to Dr. Hendricks. Rose.
Sure, thank you. I was thinking about for this question, and perhaps even more interesting than my work is some of our members' work. And so I thought of a few. There are so many things going on. Let me just be clear across the country in science centers and museums that promote understanding on these topics. One in particular that stands out, and I'm happy to drop some links in the chat after I finish speaking, is the Wild Center, which is in New York, which has a solutions exhibit, among other things, but their solutions exhibit is also virtual. And so it can reach many people beyond those that are in New York. And what I think is really unique about this is that it's, not about necessarily the problem of climate change, though I'm sure, that there's a component of that. Of course, that is a foundational understanding, but it's really about showcasing the wide number of opportunities we have available to us, and especially the wide number of things already taking place in the Adirondacks, which is where the Wild Center is located. They feature solutions that advance health and equity because, of course, the problems are intertwined, and especially showcase the particular people who are behind them, which I think is another way to really achieve that. Another really neat effort is at the Museum of Science Boston, who just this spring launched the Center for the Environment, which really tackles climate change, energy, biodiversity, pollution, well-being, all simultaneously, and brings together government, academia, industry, and certainly members of the public to really co-create a vision and an action towards a sustainable, healthy future for all. So that's another really different and neat initiative. And then the third one that sticks out for me is at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where they've got something called the Climate and Rural Systems Partnership. I think they say CRISP for this, and that is really focused on, it's a collaborative project done with the local community that aims to really just support people to talk about climate change and how it manifests in Western Pennsylvania toward the goal of ultimately organizing and doing something or many things about it. I think what I really like about this too is they really zoom in on the ways that climate change shows up locally, especially through agriculture, because that's a big component for the community, and through health, and how the kinds of solutions that they have available at their fingertips, again, also advance equity and health at the same time. One of the project outputs was just a conversation guide that was, and I say just because it sounds like it's so foundational, but without really solid support and encouragement to talk about climate, health, and equity, many of us really struggle to do so. And certainly without talking about it, we're going to have a really difficult time acting on it. And so that was one of the pieces of work that they did that I think was really impressive. So those are just a few small samples of the really incredible things going on.
Thanks so much. I'll turn it over to Dr. Littlejohn.
Right. So with this question, I think, again, there's kind of two themes here that my work serves to promote understanding in climate, health, and equity. And the first one is more of a research thread and how we work as designers with different knowledge communities, local communities, and how design often serves as a facilitator or a translator of the different knowledge systems that are happening in this kind of transdisciplinary research on climate. Design has interesting tools that do align with what the sciences use to analyze data, let's say, or show and present data, or to tell stories, right? And we call these convivial tools. I think in the academic community, it might be called boundary objects, right? Where designers create these tools that help both sides, local communities, stakeholders, the people who climate change is actually affecting, and then the communities that are trying to study it. So design kind of sits in between these two things, as helping to facilitate and translate different knowledges and knowledge systems so that they're understandable by all communities. And there's another thread here that isn't so much about climate, but really speaks to the idea of equity and storytelling and telling the right story. And this is with a project that I did for the National Gallery of Art Museum in DC for a recent exhibition that opened a few weeks ago on contemporary art in Native Americans. And if you think about in your mind, when I say Native American art, right, there's probably this image there that of a cliche of the types of artifacts and work and art that Native Americans do that isn't hailing out of the Western European idea of what contemporary art is right now. And so for this book that I worked on, with the National Galleries and their curators and their production people as on one side of the equation, and then the Native American artist and the guest curator who was Native American as well. And this idea of contemporary art, and you can imagine what maybe the visual vocabulary, if I could call it that, was imagined on both sides. And so what design does here is translate, the wishes and desires and the stories that the Native Americans want to tell about contemporary art, not traditional craft-based art, which is the kind of cliche I'm referring to. So if you ever get around to seeing this exhibition or the book, it will not look like a book about Native Americans. It is a book about contemporary Native American art that aligns it with other ideas and notions of what we know to be contemporary art. So in a sense, again, I'm putting the work that I do in the middle of these different communities as translators of stories.
Thanks, Dr. Littlejohn. And I'll turn it over to Angela.
Thank you. A key component of my work is collaboration. It's absolutely impossible to make a big difference without partnerships, without collaborations of some sort, no matter what. That's been something very important to me since I arrived at Hayti. So that being said, we implemented a couple of projects for which we were funded right before the pandemic, and the objective was to reconnect the Hayti community with downtown. We were originally one until that dreadful highway came through and segregated all over again our community from the heart of downtown. Now, over the last decade and more, downtown Durham has flourished. It's thriving. It's booming. It's its culture, its food, it's everything is going great. But that's not translating to prosperity or success on the other side because of that, just the disconnect. So we applied for funding to develop a safe route, a 1 mile route that would extend from our venue over to downtown to what's called Black Wall Street Gardens, which was right at the epicenter of the business district of Black Wall Street. We did a walk audit. We've done several research-based assessments, and over these last few years, we've garnered the attention of the city, the county, and the state So it looks like we're actually going to be able to, in the next year, develop that route. It will be a safe route. It will include shade trees, benches, seating. We're partnering with restaurants along the way. There's going to be a story walk so that people can learn about the history of the community and what was there, what's no longer there. Just a beautiful concept that is actually coming to vision soon. That's one thing, but also I remember Max telling me in a conversation, he doesn't even remember saying this, but I remember him telling me that, while the majority, studies show that the majority of people in this country acknowledge that there is such a thing as climate change, many do not talk about it. A much lower percentage of people in this country talk about it. So we embarked on a project together, Haiti and the museum, and it invited our students in our youth program to use their imagination. So it's literally imagine Durham. It's like, what would your community look like in the year 2100 based on the impacts of climate change? So we spent time with this. We engaged our kids, and parents were intrigued. Grandparents in some instances wanted to sit in these engagements with us. And the results were quite stunning. The kids and the families, they used narrative, but they used art. And the museum subsequently framed a number of the pieces that the kids did. And there was an exhibit at the museum, and many people got to share that exhibit. We brought some of it back to our venue after that, and I think it's actually traveled a little bit since then. But it was really something to be able to engage so many people from the community, and many acknowledge that they just had not thought about these things. So that's where I appreciate Max putting in my head, we don't talk about it. So we talk about it all of the time now. Also, we partner with the municipal agencies, and it looks as though we're starting to make some strides. Particularly with some of the federal funding that's come down the pipe. The city, the state, they have been undertaking environmental justice projects, going underground to remove rusted containers and things that have been polluting the ground in the Haiti community. And we've been advocating for reinvesting in the community along the corridor where we're housed, where so many residents and so many businesses still exist, but they need that reinvestment. So we're starting to see some infrastructure investment, sidewalks, lighting, safety issues that will certainly have a positive impact on health, but also we have partnered with agencies in the Durham community to plant trees, to plant shrubs, just to do some of the work that has not been done over these last few decades. So those are beautiful things. And then lastly, we are an arts organization, and many of our core programs, just really preserve our history by telling those stories through art. So we're focused on sharing those stories. We're part of a national organization of arts organizations, and we are partnered in other ways with different agencies. Some of the HBC, North Carolina Central is university is just a few blocks down from us. We partner with them, with Duke University, which is also there, and also with Durham Technical College, which offers a lot of coursework around climate and health and equity. So we're a small organization, but we, I think, do mighty work, but it's largely because of the partnering that we do, the collaborations that we have, and the understanding that we have gained from the ancestors who were there before us, and the ancestors who built that structure in 1891 and who have continued to hold it as a place of healing and health. And, therefore we're able to focus on things like climate, health, and equity. But yeah, those are just overviews of the work that we're doing and how we're doing it. Public art is also a very important element of that.
It's amazing. This hour has really flown by. I'm going to try and mush together a bunch of the last questions that I sent to y'all to synthesize a little bit and Angela, that really does segue us super nicely into sort of this last, again, mushed together question. Synthesizing, you're right. Most Americans don't report that they do not talk about climate change, at least occasionally. But to borrow a piece of lexicon that Dr. Littlejohn, that Deb just told us about, there are lots and lots of boundary objects that people are talking about within their communities. Lots of people are thinking and talking often about place. They are talking and thinking about the place that they live, place that they grew up in, the place that they know a great deal about and care about. They are also thinking and talking a great deal about art. They are thinking and talking a great deal about the humanities, about the people that live there, the people that they care about. And so I guess the squished together sort of last question that I have is, there are many people on this call and that are watching this later on that are from outside of the fields that you all represent and outside of the types of organizations that you all work with and serve. What do they have to learn from you all? What's the sort of key message that you would provide to them? Why place? Why people? Why culture? The title of this webinar as those boundary objects, the things that get people to think about these central issues of climate and of health and of equity. Why start from a place of thinking about place, people, and culture? I'm going to start this roundtable with Dr. Hendricks, with Rose.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think, those three things you said, place, people, culture, those are all immediately and deeply connectable. Like those things resonate with us. So we know our place very well and it means important things to us. We, can much more easily put ourselves in the perspective of, say, other people and people who are close to us than, say, the natural world in many cases. And culture is sort of how we relate to the world and to each other. And so when we tap into these three things, I think it makes something deeply personal and really provides a very clear invitation for people and communities more broadly to find a place in solutions.
Thanks. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Rush.
Okay. Yes, I do believe that this is not only multi-generational. I think it's can expand to various communities and people in all professions. Climate change is for real. It's happening, and until we all come to realize and share the information about the damages that fossil fuels are doing to the environment, and think more in terms of going, using solar power or other sources of energy to minimize the impact that's going on with climate change. I think we can all collectively and together make those announcements and share that information with people, and hopefully we can get as many different people in different professions, and especially the young people involved in this process. I think we can have a huge impact in the future.
Thanks, Ms. Rush. I'm going to turn it over to Angela.
I think that, we should all start from the premise that, every field can learn from another field, because as we get to know the work that exists in other fields, I think we realize that we have more in common than we don't have in common. I would not have sat down and consciously thought, gosh, we have so much in common with the Museum of Life and Science, with science, with the planetarium, but in talking about what matters and what's important and how it impacts the people whom we target to attend events and to come to our venues, we realize that we have a lot in common. Those kids learned so much about climate change, and we as instructors and as leaders learn from it, but also, gosh, we learned from them from 6 and 7-year-olds, that there's just such basic and beautiful ways to express and to portray and to picture just what that means. And it makes it so much easier to forward that work and to take that work into other spaces. So as an example, so I think that what other fields can learn from the work we do, it's like, what is important in your work? Okay, how does it overlap with my work? And you'll find that there's some tremendous overlaps. I was always in love with English and reading and literature when I growing up. You know, it wasn't math and it wasn't science, but wow, I have gotten so much more interested and so much more in tune with math and science as a result of art and English and history, you know, just things that I would not have thought would inform my my passion and appreciation for science and math. So what other fields can learn is what I learned. It's like there's something in common with all of our fields. We just have to sit down and determine what those commonalities are. And then we can collaborate and achieve big things.
Amazing. Last but not least, Dr. Littlejohn. Deb, go for it.
Right. So if I had to encapsulate what other fields could learn from design, from my field, and design and user experience, it would be that old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And if, you know, in the spaces that I'm working, in the problem spaces that I'm working in transdisciplinary research, I work with a lot of science fields, actually. And so this is really directed at you in that sense, that you know, the way science is communicated is very textual, it's very verbal, it's a lot of words, right? And I think anytime you use that word communicate, communication, storytell, put the word visual in front of that, because being able to visualize knowledge, visualize ways of working, visualizing, for example, in grant writing, you know, we have to work with conceptual frameworks when we are writing grants for funding of projects. Design and a lot of what I do is about visualizing conceptual frameworks of working that in a snapshot provide a blueprint for a research study, let's say. And I would add to that too, that, you know, when you design is very technological oriented, a lot of what we do in the studio and what we work on, for example, at the Science Museum with Max, is about translating, in this case, some of the, you know, let's call it hardcore research of the Southeastern Climate Adaptation Science Center, the reports that they do, and how do we translate that visually for different audiences, as I mentioned before. And I would say that, you know, it's probably the field that science doesn't think about in these types of collaboration. The first one that comes to mind is going to be design, because we're just kind of known as the cliche is, right, putting lipstick on the pig, as in design we say, making things pretty, but visually translating complex ideas is a science in and of itself. And so I think that's the main thing that other fields can learn from design.
It's amazing. What a nice note to end on. I will say our fields are notoriously, and I think this probably came through already through the conversation, notoriously collaborative. The panelists here, though we didn't have time for an audience Q&A, I think are interested in hearing from you also. And so I encourage our panelists, if they feel comfortable, to put their emails in the chat for where folks can reach them for potential future collaboration. I think our work fits very nicely within an ecosystem, not only of how people learn about climate health and equity within local context, within different knowledge systems and processes, as Dr. Littlejohn pointed out, but also in being these boundary objects themselves, as far as how people have opportunities to meaningfully affect research agendas related to these. The call to action that I have here is to think about how you can support and enhance the excellent work of community storytelling and stewardship. Museums, heritage centers, places of informal and place-based learning are key collaborators for community knowledge and expertise. And how will you uplift and support that work in your research? How might your work aid in the telling and preserving of these stories? Again, I think many or most of our panelists are very interested in connecting with you further for questions and also for future collaboration. The work that this does is extraordinarily important in the ecosystem, not only for learning and for place-based learning, but also as a place for us to do better research, to do better storytelling, to actually do climate action. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Rebecca Ward, to close out this session. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all for a truly wonderful webinar today. Just a note to everyone in attendance, this has been recorded. Once it's ready, we will post it online and you can access it from our website, carolinascap.com. And please tune in November for the next webinar in our series. We'll be talking about infrastructure tipping points and on-site wastewater systems in coastal Carolinas. So please join us then. You'll receive an email about it when it comes up. Please reach out if you have any questions in the meantime. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. I'm going to stop recording.